When the name Bloober Team gets brought up in the gaming community, there tends to be a negative reaction from a lot of gamers, especially as of late with their Silent Hill 2 remake literally days away. And while we can chalk up some of the remake hate to quote-unquote fans who've never actually played the game and are just wanting to complain about it online, there's no denying that Bloober Team has drawn the ire of lots of people for the better part of a decade, stemming back to their first breakthrough hit, Layers of Fear. While that game did very well commercially and blew up in the Let's Play scene, it did get memed on a fair amount.
I think I'm gonna die on camera. I think I'm gonna die on camera.
But it also set the groundwork for the formula that Bloober Team would iterate upon for the next 8 years, for better or worse. Their formula has often been criticized for a number of reasons, chief among them being their tendency to take after their influences very heavily. As such, they're usually cited as a developer who misses the point of the thing they're taking after. And by now, I think a lot of you are probably familiar with their games in one way or another, either having played one, or having watched someone played it, or just hearing people talk shit about them online. While I certainly think they have lots of issues, today, I want to talk about the time in 2017 when they got it all right, when everything clicked for them, and they actually put out something that still feels memorable and fresh to this day. That game was Observer, one of their lesser known titles that I think deserved so much more attention than it got. But before we dive into that, I think it's important to set the stage and give a brief background on the style of Bloober's work, so I can better explain why Observer works so well, despite still mostly sticking to their formula. So let's get into it. Now, Bloober Team games are pretty distinct and have a lot of shared traits throughout each and every one. Their excellent lighting and art direction is about the only consistently great element that even their detractors would acknowledge. But aside from that, their style can kind of be broken into 3 other components. 1, a focus on the experience over traditional gameplay. 2, their tendency to wear their influences on their sleeves. And 3, questionably handled stories about trauma. Starting with the first component, Bloober Team games are usually very simple in terms of gameplay, often being described as walking simulators, which for me personally is not really a negative because games are art and I don't think there's anything wrong with aiming to offer different types of experiences. Not every game needs to have the same broad appeal, and that's fine. And in the case of Bloober Team, their main focus is about putting a trippy, mind-bending audio-visual experience above all else. And while their visuals and audio design are great, they can also start to run into some problems in 2 key areas. For one, if the games lack the necessary context, the abstract visuals can start to feel a bit random or forced. Like, sure, there's obviously some visual metaphors here, but also sometimes you'll get stuff like this, which, yeah, it looks kind of neat, I guess, but it's only really there for the sake of being weird and crazy. Another issue comes up if it gets overused, which both Layers of Fear games are guilty of. It's kinda neat the first few times, and they do create a few interesting moments with it, but since there's no traditional gameplay, it's pretty much the only thing that's happening. And after a while, it starts to get stale and expected. In this regard, I would almost liken their style to like riding a Halloween carnival ride, where it's a straightforward experience that really serves as an excuse to throw a bunch of thrills and chills at you. Now, again, I'm okay with games being more simple, but I'm not a huge fan of using the same gimmick over and over, and I think their games could benefit from added narrative context, more mechanics, or to just use those crazy moments more sparingly so as not to overload the player. Regarding their second component, wearing their influences on their sleeve, this is one that tends to get them in the most trouble in my eyes. It's very obvious, just from looking at even a few clips here, that Silent Hill and PT are far and away their biggest influences. But they've certainly taken notes from a host of other games, films, and even paintings. A lot of people tend to write them off just on this aspect alone, but I do want to say that stealing ideas isn't necessarily bad. I mean, there's a famous quote, "Good artists borrow, great artists steal," and I mean, Quentin Tarantino, Sam Lake, and Hideo Kojima are some of the most well-known and acclaimed creators out there, and they're all very direct with their influences, sometimes just straight up taking things wholesale. Now, are their works just worse because of their direct influences? Fuck no, I'm a huge fan of all 3. But my point here is that there's nothing wrong in taking something from your influences, but it comes down to both the execution as well as making sure your work still has an identity of its own. And in my opinion, this is the area where Bloober Team falters the most, because they can often go really overboard with the references, which in turn can make those elements feel either very hollow or even just disconnected from one another. Their game Blair Witch has the latter, where there's just so many different elements and gameplay mechanics taken from other games, but none of these elements end up working well together, and after a while, you're probably just gonna be like, wait a minute, what does this even have to do with the Blair Witch? Why am I fighting literal Blair Witch monsters with the flashlight combat from Alan Wake? Those monsters don't even have anything to do with the main story. What is even happening? The Medium, on the other hand, has the issue of feeling a bit hollow, where it's basically just their take on Silent Hill. And while I think it actually does some really cool things with its split-screen mechanics and puzzles, I mean, it's hard to look at this game and not think that you're just playing a Silent Hill 2 fan game. A well-made fan game, but a fan game nonetheless. And lastly, we have their final component, poorly handled stories about trauma, which I think is definitely the biggest reason people are skeptical of them taking on the Silent Hill 2 remake. Now, every Bloober game has a story that contains themes or elements of trauma or mental illness in one way or another, and most of them fall pretty flat. I know some people characterize their shortcomings here as being malicious, but honestly, I really just see it as them mostly trying too hard to be like all those other things they're taking inspiration from, even when they don't need to be. A similar issue arises in the Medium, where it's very clear that they desperately wanted to make their own pyramid head metaphor monster, but in doing so, they ended up writing themselves into a corner, and so elements of the story start to contradict one another, and then you end up with a really messy narrative that makes the pedophile demon monster guy seem less bad than the others, and yeah, it just gets weird and messy. But again, I don't think this is malice. I think most of this is born from their desire to just be the thing that they like, instead of using those influences as a springboard to create their own experience. But with all that out of the way, that brings us to Observer, which, funny enough, was actually one of their earlier releases, and kinda came out before they truly became maligned by a lot of the community. So I think it fell under some people's radar. And I'm gonna be very direct with this. I think Observer fucking rocks, and manages to avoid pretty much every pitfall their other games have, despite being very much a Bloober Team game. So let's dive into that now. What is Observer, and why do I think it bucks the trend?
The year is 2084. If they told me what the world would become, I would not have believed them. First, there was the nanophage, the disease of transition. A digital plague that swept across the land, killing thousands upon thousands of augmented souls. A heavy cost for meddling with our minds and bodies. Then came the war, the big one. The great decimation. The West killed the East killed the West. There were no winners. Except for Kaiwa.
Observer is a cyberpunk horror game where you play as Detective Daniel Lazarski, voiced by the late great Rutger Hauer. Dan is an observer, a detective augmented with a Dream Eater apparatus that lets him hack into people's minds and see their memories. At the start of the game, Dan receives a call from his estranged son, who appears to be in grave danger. Dan traces the call to a nearby slum and heads over to investigate, uncovering a winding trail of murder, illegal dealings, rogue AI, and corporate sabotage. Observer is the reason why I have any faith in Bloober Team to eventually make another good game. It properly utilizes all their strengths and avoids all their weaknesses in such a way that it totally baffles me that they've never done anything else like it. Because it's really not that much different from their usual formula, so I feel like this shouldn't be the outlier. It still has the same style of abstract visuals, it's very clearly inspired by Blade Runner, I mean, Rutger Hauer's in it, and it still has some story elements that deal with trauma. But it uses its visual style and influences as a gateway into a narrative experience, not as a crutch to copy from. It has a voice and an angle, and I think it being directly set in Poland allows Bloober to make it feel more personal to them instead of just having a nondescript Western setting that could technically be set anywhere and the game would still play out the same. Be warned that there will be some spoilers from here on out. I don't think anything I'm going to say will ruin the experience for you, and I won't talk specifics about the ending, but if you want to go in completely blind, here's your warning. Okay, let's get into the weeds of why this game works, starting with those abstract visuals they're known for. These visuals are, of course, present here, but instead of being a theme park ride where shit just kinda happens, the game uses them sparingly and contextualizes them, which makes them significantly more impactful, because the abstract moments only happen when you're hacking into someone's memories. And since the nature of a memory can be hazy and incomplete, it makes sense that exploring people's minds won't yield 100% concrete results. Thus, Bloober Team's abstract visuals are a perfect match. And they absolutely nail it here, giving you just enough metaphor and narrative bits to piece together a story without ever breaking away from the visual experience. And setting the rule in place that these moments only happen when you're plugged into someone's mind works really well for the narrative because it allows them to eventually break that rule in a really fun way. See, midway through the game, you enter an apartment and there's like a weird little glitch that happens on the walls. But this is a world with, a bunch of holograms and projections and stuff, so most people, myself included, will probably think nothing of it. But once you venture into the apartment, things start to slowly get weirder and weirder, and eventually it feels like the whole room is breaking apart until...
Desynchronization imminent. Administer medication.
Give me the duration of the last sequence.
You are connected for 16 minutes and 43 seconds, real time.
16 minutes? Am I losing it?
This is a fantastic moment where the narrative and visual abstraction meet to mess with the player's expectations, and it works beautifully. Because from this point on, you can never fully trust what's happening. You're no longer in full control, which puts you on edge and also sets up later story moments. If the game was overloading you with the crazy visuals every 2 seconds, well, this moment wouldn't really mean anything. But by holding back for a large part of the game, they're able to deliver a real payoff that is both memorable and narratively fulfilling. And of course, like their previous games, there is also a metaphor monster here, but it works significantly better because, again, the game gives it much better context. Because the only times that you're seeing this thing are when you're in one of the mind hack sequences, and in the first few instances, you're living out the memories of someone who was stealing top secret information. In these memories, she's extremely nervous and scared of being caught, so this monster is a representation of both the corporation that's after her, as well as her fears. Giving it this context, as well as having you literally play out a game of corporate cat and mouse, does wonders for the sequences. And while I'm not going to sit here and tell you I think that the stealth gameplay is amazing because it's pretty simple, the fact that they add good narrative and gameplay context makes the moments far more engaging than any monster sequence they've done before. Compare that to the monster in Layers of Fear 2 that is a faceless entity that shows up randomly without any real rhyme or reason and then disappears after a short 20-second chase scene. Far, far less interesting. But arguably the biggest difference between this and their other work is the focus on building out the world and taking you off that linear ride, giving you more room to explore. Being stuck in a dilapidated tenement building for 90% of the game was a great decision, and it allows them to pack all the detail they can into it. Winding hallways, add-on rooms that were clearly built in a rush, modern tech that probably hasn't received firmware updates in a decade, a dining hall that is basically just 2 apartments with the wall torn down and a few tables thrown in. There's just so many great details here, and giving you the space to explore this and find tons of side stories really allows the excellent world building to shine. And it's one of my favorite worlds in any game, and it does something the majority of other cyberpunk games are either too trite or too cowardly to do. It gets fucking mean and nasty. This isn't neon lights and sex shops used as set dressing for a joyous romp through futuristic LA. This isn't a bunch of cool dudes bumping synthwave, throwing around goofy slang and yelling vague stuff about how the corpos are bad. Hell, this isn't even mysterious loner listening to jazz in the rain. Instead, this is a filthy, decaying, rancid, cruel game where you spend your time mucking around in the literal shit and blood of society. If you can, I'd recommend playing the OG version of this game for this reason alone. The remaster is cool, and I'm sure the new content is neat, but the OG visuals are far more grimy, and I think that fits the atmosphere and world to perfection. But aside from wandering the halls and hacking into some people's minds, you're gonna spend the bulk of your time knocking on doors and questioning the residents of the building, which leads to many entertaining encounters.
Nah, I don't pay much attention to the other tenants. Bunch of losers. A lot of...
You're so dumb. Not as dumb as you are. Nuh-uh, you're way dumber.
Shut the fuck up!
Not upstanding citizens like you.
You bet your ass.
But it's not all just a bunch of laughs, as everyone here is, in one way or another, a victim of Chiron, the game's glowing symbol of oppression and late-stage capitalism. The tenants you're surrounded by are all beaten down and broken in one way or another. Some are criminals, sleazing it up in the blind spot of the police. Others are veterans or former prize fighters, wrongfully denied medical attention or a pension, and thus discarded down to the bottom and left to rot. And some are just regular people, trying to numb the pain however they can. Be it drugs, alcohol, sex, violence, or plugging into VR for so long that their limbs literally begin to atrophy. The side stories flesh things out even further, with plenty of vile moments to be found, from organ farms to human trafficking rings, and ironically, this is where Bloober's past issues of telling stories about trauma don't really rear their head, and they can fully embrace sleazing it up, because, well, that's what the game's about, especially thanks to its hard-nosed asshole of a main character.
I gotta get out of this hellhole!
Reality, pal. Reboot and flip back. It's the best we got.
Dan is a literal corporate leech, and the only reason he's even paying this place any mind is because his son was last seen here. I mean, the residents make it pretty clear that the cops rarely visit this place because it's been deemed too low class for them to even care about. And sure enough, when Dan arrives in the complex, he pretty much disregards what people say and does whatever he wants. Very early on, the game has you break into the janitor's office looking for a tenant registry, and when the janitor catches you, Dan simply says,
Police business, I know what I'm doing.
and the poor janitor's shattered mind doesn't really know any better than to just give you full access to the building. And so off you go, banging on doors, questioning the eclectic bunch of locals. Your dialogue choices can play him slightly more empathetic, but still, Dan doesn't really care about the people living here.
You don't sound fine. Is this man home now?
He's always home. He's in the walls. Please, just go, or we'll both be in trouble.
Ma'am, I really don't want to leave you like this.
It's all right. I am where I want to be.
Wonderful. Aren't we having a mad fucking tea party?
Even after watching a victim die, he still makes a snarky remark upon finding the victim's drug inhaler.
Well, you got your last picks. Hope it was worth it.
Some might label this as being insensitive, but yeah, that's kind of the point. I mean, sure, it's mean, but it fits. Because Dan's not a user insert. He's his own character, and one that happens to be the most hated form of cop in this game's universe. Which also makes the choice to have lots of the brain hack sequences play out from the perspective of a poor, beaten down lowlife even more thematically fitting. It's literally putting the cop in the shoes of those beneath him. This is why it's very key that the gameplay in Observer, while simple, actively reinforces the story it's trying to get across. By having mechanics based around interrogating random people, going around wherever you please, breaking the law if it means benefiting your goals, while also forcing you to play out the memories of the other side, it creates a far more engaging narrative experience, as opposed to walking around and seeing a series of disconnected jump scares. Of course, Dan isn't simply just some random asshole cop. He's been broken down by the world as well, and a good chunk of the main story revolves around understanding why he and his son have become estranged, and how Dan came to be the lumbering hunk of machinery that he is. You can see flashes of his humor and humanity throughout the game, but he's become selfish and has been shaped into a life of apathy for those beneath him. As his backstory gets gradually revealed, you learn that his own selfish actions and his inability to take accountability for said actions have shaped him into a withdrawn, cynical asshole. And so to many people of the world, he is the monster. And yet even still, even after all this, even being above the majority of the citizens in this world, Dan is ultimately still a cog in the machine. operating at the will of the corporation in control. Of course, I shouldn't go any further though without singing the praises of the legendary Rutger Hauer, who lends such a gravitas to this role. His deep, gravelly voice and blunt line readings really help make Dan so compelling. His only real spurts of emotion come out when he's talking about his son or for similar selfish reasons, and for everything else, he's very cold, and I think it works perfectly.
Well, that's too bad because he's dead now. I gotta go.
Whoa. Hey, hold on, Lasarski. What did you say?
I said I gotta go.
In my eyes, I think the harsh and bitter world and its broken characters are a much more interesting depiction of dystopian social hierarchy and systems of oppression, as opposed to fighting generic gangs. And this was clearly a much better topic for Bloober to cover instead of just defaulting back to trying to be Silent Hill. And this darker tone plays well into the main story, which deals with some classic cyberpunk themes of transhumanism, consciousness beyond your body, and corporate control. Now, admittedly, some of the story can get a little convoluted as there's so many different moving parts, but I really don't mind it, especially since the game is working around the idea of your character losing control. And I think all of it comes together really well, and both endings are, in my opinion, satisfyingly grim, with one in particular being so mean, but so funny, and really fitting for what this game is trying to achieve. Now, there are some small issues here and there. I'm not a fan of some of the cheap jump scare attempts, and like I said before, the stealth sequences work well, but the actual stealth mechanics themselves are pretty basic and can be occasionally finicky. But honestly, there's nothing that really takes away from the overall experience in my eyes, and that's the main thing Bloober is going for after all, the experience. I reviewed this game back when it released in 2016, which was a terrible video, by the way. I don't even think I had a real mic then. But I had assumed that replaying this game 7 years later would yield much less positive results. But man, even after all this time, it really does feel like something fresh and the perfect example of Bloober utilizing their strengths and minimizing their weaknesses, taking all their inspirations and using it as a springboard to create a new, compelling adventure. It's a damn shame, then, that their next game would be Layers of Fear 2, a game that has absolutely nothing to say and is entirely banking on the style and iconography of better art that came before it, regardless of if the references make any sense within the narrative. Repulsion, Metropolis, Ringu, The Shining, A Trip to the Moon, Psycho, and The Wizard of fucking Oz are among the many films that get their own individual set pieces that serve no purpose other than to be a reference, all building towards the moment where you walk through all the murder scenes from the movie 7, including the ending of the film.
Hey, remember this movie? Remember this thing that was actually good and didn't suck ass? Well, dude, I would much rather go rewatch 7 than finish this fucking game. Are you kidding me?
That game almost feels like a self-parody. Like, if you had told me that Layers of Fear 2 was a game made by someone trying to make fun of Bloober's penchant for stealing ideas without understanding them, I might have believed you. It's vapid, it's tedious, and it doesn't do much other than remind me of the better art I could be experiencing instead of playing this. Also doesn't help that both Blair Witch and The Medium had similar problems as well. But even still, Observer is good enough that it gives me some bit of hope that they might be able to return to their peak in the future. I don't know what it's gonna take, and maybe going from making a Silent Hill fan game to then literally making Silent Hill 2 probably isn't helping their identity crisis, but hopefully a fresh reset afterwards will do them some good. As for the immediate future, we have said Silent Hill 2 remake coming up in a couple days, and I'm cautiously optimistic for it. I think from a visual standpoint, they're gonna do a really good job, and honestly, even though I don't think it needs a remake, I am very interested in seeing the game through a new structure and perspective. Story-wise, people are worried because of Bloober's track record with mishandling themes, but since they're just remaking what was already here, I'm actually less worried about them mishandling it, and more worried about them softening the rough edges of the original game story. But that's not really a Bloober Team specific issue. That would kind of be my fear for any company remaking Silent Hill 2. Unlike some of the vocal people online, I have actually played the original game, and a lot of people who haven't would probably be a bit surprised just how graphic and shocking some of these moments are. Of course, all those moments serve a purpose, and it would just be a real shame to see the game toned down to potentially appease a more modern audience, but only time will tell. Anyway, that's gonna do it for this video. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you got something out of it, and if you end up giving Observer a shot, please let me know what you think. I would love to hear from your experiences with the game as well. I initially had wanted to make this a much longer video that was going to be like a Bloober Team retrospective, and I even played all the games in preparation for that. But then I got caught up in some work, and then began to run out of time to make this before the remake comes out, so I kind of had to scramble to get it together in the fashion that it is. Anyway, I'll definitely be reviewing the Silent Hill 2 remake soon, and hope to get out a few more videos before the year comes to a close, so make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.